John 1:20. Et confessus est, et non negavit, et confessus est quia non sum ego Christus. And he confessed, or admitted, and he did not deny, and he confessed or admitted that I am not the Christ. John now is describing what John the Baptist was doing when he answered the question of the priests and Levites sent by the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem to ask John the Baptist, "Who are you?" And probably that question, "Who are you?" which we had at the end of the last verse, was not intended only to ask, "Who are you, John? Where do you come from? Who are your parents?" etc., but also, "Who do you claim to be?" And that they were asking that deeper question is indicated by this verse here. It seems that perhaps one of the implications of this question from the priests and Levites was, "Are you claiming to be the Christ?" And here John the Evangelist gives us the answer of John the Baptist. So let's look at the Latin. Et confessus est. Confessus est comes from the deponent verb confiteor, to confess, and like all deponent verbs, here it has a passive form, but in fact an active meaning. That is, he confessed, he admitted, he declared plainly that I am not the Christ, that he was not the Christ. And the way that this is expressed by the evangelist is extremely emphatic. Look at this. Et confessus est, et non negavit. Et confessus est. Really, strictly speaking, in grammatical terms, there's no reason for the evangelist to have written non negavit. He did not deny, because that's already implied in confessus est, right? That's the meaning of confessus est. He confessed freely, he admitted freely. This is the truth. Did not deny is another way of saying the same thing, and this other way of saying the same thing, when combined with the repetition of what we've already heard, confessus est, adds great emphasis to this denial. In other words, John the Evangelist is taking great pains to indicate John the Baptist left no grounds for confusion about who he was and who he was claiming to be. Confessus est, in both cases, is our third person, singular, perfect indicative, here of the deponent verb confiteor, as I said just a moment ago. Non negavit is the same form, third person, singular, perfect, active, indicative from nego, negare, quia. Now, when we introduce this quotation, we've got to notice the sudden intrusion of this conjunctive word, quia. Here it's the equivalent of quod, that, in English, as often in the Vulgate. This is a little bit strange. It's strange because earlier in verse 19, John the Evangelist had simply given us the quotation without really any introductory words. But here we've got quia. He said, or he confessed, that. And this is unusual because in classical Latin, we would expect the accusative infinitive construction. For instance, something like confessus est Johannes Baptista se non esse Christum. In other words, we would expect indirect speech. He confessed or admitted that he was not the Christ. He was not the Messiah. And it might be worth noting, just as an aside here, that Christus is just the transliteration into Latin of the Greek term Christos, which means the anointed one, which in turn is the equivalent of Hebrew Messiah, the deliverer of Israel, for whom everyone had been waiting for so many centuries. So, even though confessus est se non esse Christum is what we would expect in classical Latin, this illustrates the greater freedom with which the translators of the Vulgate render the Greek. And in this case, again, we're sticking pretty close to the Greek construction, even though it produces somewhat odd Latin. It's been said quite memorably by those who have written on the topic of the Latin of the Vulgate and some of its peculiar expressions, that 9/10 of those things which seem confusing or strange to someone trained in classical Latin can be explained by the adherence of the translators, the close adherence of the translators to the Greek text. And I think in general that's true. It might be a bit of an overstatement, but often I have found that to be true. So quia is not strictly necessary for the sense here, and primes us to expect a sort of construction that we don't get, because what we actually get is a direct quotation. These were John the Baptist's words, non sum ego Christus. And you'll probably notice here that ego is not strictly necessary, but you guessed it, it corresponds to a similar emphatic use of the first person singular pronoun in the Greek text of the New Testament.